Did you know that King Charles II might be the most unlucky monarch in history? His father, King Philip III, had ruled over Spain for 21 years when Charles II was born. But this wasn't a happy occasion. See, Philip was already on his sixth wife, and no one thought that he would ever have a son. So when Charles was born, he was immediately made heir to the throne. This meant that Philip had to share his power with a child. And, as you can imagine, this was not something that he was happy about. Throughout Charles's childhood, his father kept finding ways to make his life miserable, from making him watch executions to having him locked up in a tower for 18 hours a day. And it only got worse as Charles got older. When Charles was finally able to rule, he wasted no time in making his own mark on history by losing a war against the Dutch and then having his kingdom invaded by Napoleon. By the end of Charles's reign, Spain was a shadow of its former self, and the Habsburg Dynasty was on the decline, which is why this royal family had such bad genes that their entire bloodline died out within 200 years, and it's all because they married too much. For centuries, European royals were marrying their cousins, their aunts, their nieces. You know, when you marry someone who's too close to you, you increase the chance of having a child with genetic problems. And these genetic problems often resulted in early death. Now, this wasn't really a problem in the Middle Ages because they didn't really have medical care. So if you were born with a heart defect or a lung disease, you just died. But as medical care improved, people with these conditions survived longer, which meant that they had kids, which meant that the next generation had even more genetic problems. And this is how, over time, centuries of inbreeding led to the end of the royal line of Luxembourg. And it could have been a lot worse if we hadn't stopped at first cousins. Because if we go back further in history, like to the 1700s, you can find all sorts of crazy marriages. People were marrying their siblings, their parents, even their grandparents. That's why it's important to remember where your relatives are on your family tree, because it could save your life. Did you know that there's a real jaw so big it can fit 2 golf balls inside? This is the Habsburg Jaw. It's the name given to a physical deformity caused by years of inbreeding in the royal family of Habsburg, Austria. You see, back in the 18th century, it was fashionable for wealthy families to marry their cousins to keep their wealth and power in the family. But this led to a genetic flaw passed down through generations. A jaw that got bigger and bigger with each passing year. And it wasn't just any old jaw. This jaw could fit 2 golf balls side by side. That's how big it was. Eventually, the jawbone grew so large that it became a medical marvel, attracting the attention of doctors and scientists from all over Europe. They would come to Vienna to examine the jaw and try to figure out what had caused this deformity. But the Habsburg jaw didn't just cause physical pain. It also caused a lot of social awkwardness. The Habsburg men were known for their massive grins, which could stretch from ear to ear. And this made it difficult for them to hide their teeth, even when they were trying to be sneaky. Inbreeding is bad, right? We all know that. But why? Why is it bad? Well, let's go back in history for some answers. The Habsburg family ruled over Europe for hundreds of years. They were the kings and queens of Spain, of France, of England, of Ireland, of Portugal. And they were all related. They all shared a common ancestor, King Philip IV of Spain. And because they were so closely related, they had a lot of, physical problems. Now, the Habsburgs, they also had a problem with mental illness. You see, when 2 people who are closely related have children, those children inherit a double dose of recessive genes from each parent. And some of those genes, they cause disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So you might be thinking, okay, well, they were just unlucky, right? Well, no. It turns out that inbreeding increases the risk of mental illness by a factor of 10. So the next time someone tells you that you look a little bit Habsburg, you'll know what to blame. Charles II, King of England, died 300 years ago today. Charles II came to power when England was in the middle of the Civil War. As a result, he spent most of his early life in exile in Normandy. He lived there so long that when he finally returned to England in 1660, it was like a homecoming for him. The people cheered and celebrated his return. After the war, Charles II went on to rule over a period of great prosperity and cultural flourishing known as the Restoration. He also had a very public affair with an Italian opera singer named Madame de Montespan. They had a son out of wedlock, and the king arranged for him to be baptized in secret. Later in life, Charles II married a Spanish princess named Marie Theresa. They had one child together, but it was a girl, not a boy. So Charles II's secret son was made the heir to the throne. Charles II died in 1685 without any surviving legitimate male heirs. His secret son Louis was the rightful king, but he died just 2 years later. So Charles's brother James II became king instead. Now, we all know that the Habsburg Dynasty was famous for its, shall we say, robust family planning. But they weren't the only royal family to do this. In fact, inbreeding was so common among European royalty that there's an entire subreddit dedicated to the topic. And some of the Habsburgs' relatives even made it to the throne of England. Take, for example, King Charles II, who ruled from 1649 to 1660. His father, King James I, was the son of King Charles I, and his mother, Henrietta Maria, was the daughter of King Charles II of Spain. So you can probably guess what happened next. The royal inbreeding didn't stop there. King Charles II had a sister named Mary, who upon her accession to the throne, married her first cousin, King Louis XIV of France. Their children would go on to produce more inbred offspring, including the infamous Marie Antoinette, who would later be beheaded during the French Revolution. What medical science says about the dangers of inbreeding. I'm a medical doctor. Let's talk about what medical science actually says about inbreeding. It is well known that inbreeding, which is mating between close relatives, can cause a lot of problems for our health. But what does the science say exactly? Well, it all boils down to our genes. We inherit half of our DNA from our mother and half from our father. And when two people who are closely related have children, those children will inherit a higher percentage of their DNA from one parent, making them more susceptible to genetic disorders. For example, certain genetic disorders like cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia are caused by recessive genes. This means that if you have one copy of the gene, you won't get the disorder, but you can pass it on to your children. If both parents are carriers of the disease, there is a 25% chance their child will inherit 2 copies of the gene and develop the disorder. So, the more closely related the parents are, the higher the chance that their children will inherit these harmful recessive genes and develop genetic disorders. And that is why medical science strongly discourages inbreeding. The last time you heard of the Habsburg Dynasty, it was arguably at the peak of its power. But how did this once mighty empire fade into obscurity? Well, it's a tale of 2 cities, Vienna and Madrid. You see, in the early 17th century, Vienna was the seat of the Habsburg monarchy. But after the Battle of Caransebs, the capital was moved to Madrid. And with that, the Habsburgs became the royal family of Spain. But while they were at it, they also picked up the title of Holy Roman Emperor. And so it was that the Habsburgs ruled over a vast empire that stretched from the North Sea to the South China Sea. But ruling over such a large and diverse empire proved to be difficult, especially as the dynasty grew weaker over time. And by the 18th century, the Habsburg grip on power was starting to slip. In fact, by 1806, the French had taken over much of their territory, and after the Napoleonic Wars, the Habsburg dynasty ended. But that's a story for another time. The new king is sick. How did Charles develop such frail health? Let's go back to the beginning. As a child, Charles had a very difficult start to life. He contracted smallpox at the age of 3, which left him with no hair and almost blind. He was also very frail and had frequent bouts of pneumonia. As a result, he was sent to live with his grandmother, the Queen Mother, for most of his childhood. By the time he was 6, he was already showing signs of the stutter that would plague him for the rest of his life. At school, he was bullied for his stutter and his size. In his teens, Charles developed a severe case of acne, which made him self-conscious, and he would often cover up with makeup. This continued into his adult life. In his early 20s, he developed a drinking problem which he kept secret from the public. He also had a serious car crash which left him with cuts and bruises. Despite all this, Charles remained positive and was determined to make his health better. He took up smoking, ironically, to help him with his stutter, and he also started exercising regularly. These two things, along with therapy, helped him manage his health issues, and he was able to live a relatively normal life. All right, let's do some armchair medicine. This is a famous painting of King Charles II. He was the King of England from 1660 to 1685, and this painting was done in 1667, just 3 years after he took the throne. Now, when I look at this painting, there's a lot of things that jump out to me. The first thing is how thin he is. You can see his ribs here. You can see his clavicle. This is what we call a wasting disease. It's a sign of malnutrition. Now, when someone is malnourished, they get a pot belly. You can see that here. The next thing I want to point out is his hair. This is a sign of another disease called hyperthyroidism. Hyperthyroidism can also cause hair loss. The last thing I want to point out are his eyes. This is a condition called exophthalmos. It's a bulging of the eyes. This can be caused by a number of different things, but it's most commonly caused by an autoimmune disease called Graves' disease. So overall, when I look at this painting, I see a very sick man. This is not what we would consider a healthy king. Why doesn't Charles have an heir? The answer might surprise you. When Charles became king, he was over 70 years old and had already had his vasectomy reversed. Why? Well, it's because of a power struggle between him and his younger brother, Prince Andrew. Charles wanted to be king, but Andrew wanted to be king as well. So they made a deal. Charles would get the throne, but Andrew would get something else, their father's title of Duke of Edinburgh. But there was a catch. Andrew couldn't have any children, so Charles wouldn't have any competition. Now, you might think that this is just a silly little story about two brothers who couldn't get along, but it actually has huge implications for the future of the monarchy. You see, Charles and Camilla couldn't have children of their own, so they had to rely on Prince William and Kate Middleton to produce heirs. And now William and Kate are having trouble conceiving, which means that Charles may never have the heir that he so desperately wants. And if that happens, Prince Andrew will be next in line, which could lead to a whole new set of problems. Stay tuned to find out what happens next. Did you know that there is a secret Spanish dynasty that no one knows about? The history of Spain is full of ups and downs, just like the stock market. In the 16th century, Spain was at the peak of its power. It was ruled by the Habsburg Dynasty, and this family had been in charge for over 300 years. But by the end of the 17th century, they were getting a little too powerful, and the Spanish people wanted someone else to take the throne. So they brought in the Bourbons. The Bourbons were a French family, and they started the trend of hiring mercenaries to fight their battles for them. This worked out pretty well, as the Spanish people were not known for their fighting skills. The Bourbon dynasty lasted for over 200 years, until the early 1800s when Napoleon invaded Spain. After Napoleon was defeated, the Spanish throne was offered to a Bourbon prince named Ferdinand, who would become famous for two things: starting the Spanish Civil War and giving up his throne to his son Alfonso. And that, my friends, is how we got the royal family tree. Who is this mysterious king, and why do artists never shy away from showing his ugly portraits? The answer might surprise you. Throughout history, there has only been one king who has sat for official portraits with a birth defect. That king is King George II of England. He was born with 2 extra fingers on one hand, making him the only monarch in the royal line of succession to have this deformity. When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, the throne passed to James I of Scotland, who became James VI of England. However, he was not the only child of Elizabeth I. She also had an illegitimate son named Henry, who was born with 2 extra fingers on his left hand. Henry's deformity was so severe that it caused him great pain, and his hand had to be amputated below the wrist. But this didn't stop him from pursuing a life of luxury and debauchery. As a result of his mother's actions, Henry's portrait was commissioned by her to be hung alongside her own in the Palace of Whitehall. And because he was born with a condition called polydactyly, which means he had more than 5 fingers on his hand, artists felt that it was important to depict this accurately in his portraits. So that's why. Okay, you need to see this really quick. I've always wondered if someone could make a simple animation or diagram explaining the effects of inbreeding. So here's how it works. When you have 2 parents that are not related at all, like in this example, their offspring will have a 50% chance of inheriting an allele, or a version of a gene, from each parent. So if one parent has brown eyes and the other has blue eyes, the child could end up with either one or the other, or even a combination of both, like green eyes. But when you have 2 parents that are closely related, like first cousins, the offspring have a 75% chance of inheriting the same allele from each parent. So if one parent has brown eyes and the other has blue eyes, the child will most likely end up with brown eyes because they got the brown eye allele from both parents. And that's why inbreeding is bad. You're increasing the chances of passing on harmful recessive traits, like having 2 copies of a gene that causes cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. So keep your family tree clean, my friends. Don't forget to share this video so that everyone knows how to avoid inbreeding.